It's interesting and rather sad that we've just had this piping alarm on our phones telling us that there's an emergency, and yet nobody on the BBC seems to have spent any time telling us or reminding us that today is the Feast of St. George. At least it's the Feast of St. George if you follow the Western calendar. And George is one of 14 holy helpers. George was particularly venerated in the Middle Ages for his care of domestic animals, probably more so than even Francis of Assisi. He is the patron saint of soldiers. He was the person to invoke in the case of plague or leprosy or disease. He was the saint, really, that we should have turned to during COVID. But he was also the saint who appeared during the First World War in a ghostly image at the Battle of Mons. He's the saint who inspired the George Cross in 1940. He's the saint that you would see fighting the dragon, that mythical animal. But he had nothing to do with soldiering, as far as we can see. He simply refused to sacrifice to the emperor, and so fell foul of, like so many Christians, he fell foul of the imperial cult and the Christian prohibition of sacrificing to any other god, but the God of Christianity. And we don't venerate George exclusively. Catalonia, Venice, Portugal, Russia, Ethiopia, all share George as a patron saint. And George isn't English. There's nothing English about him. George was born in Turkey, so it's appropriate that today is also the Turkish Republic Day. And I was watching a program earlier where President Erdogan sat round a table with a crowd of youngsters who were forming a youth parliament and taking decisions as ministers of this and ministers of that with the president. But St. George, died under Diocletian. And it was only in the 9th century that all these sort of military knighthood ideas started to gather through a book called The Golden Legend. By that point, he was already a saint. He was canonized in 494 by Pope Gelasius. And he was adopted as a patron of our country, of England, after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. So it's not for nothing that Shakespeare's Henry cries, "God for Harry England and St. George." By that point, of course, he'd already been adopted as the patron of the Order of the Garter, that incredibly old heraldic order that meets in Windsor Castle once a year. St. George was adopted in 1348, so before he was adopted as patron of the country, he was adopted as patron of the heraldic, the chivalric order of the Garter. So I'm just laying it on a little thick here because I think the BBC should have made some mention of the fact that it's St. George's Day today. But all we get instead is Sue Ella Braven telling us that we're not going to respect the European Court of Human Rights. Well, I remember taking a case through the European Court of Human Rights and being successful. It took a long time, and I'm very grateful to the European Court of Human Rights for all that they do. So you're not going to hear me supporting Sue Ella Braven, even if you thought that on this occasion I might. No, not remotely. As far as I'm concerned, there's only one dragon in this situation, and that I shall stand up to, like St. George, and face firmly. No, 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 to invoke the words of Mrs. Thatcher.